Today, we revisit a much maligned Supreme Pontiff, the last who, for my money, taught what could be recognizably the Catholic faith for most of his papacy, and I say most because he permitted the changes to the Holy Week liturgy at the hands of Annibale Bugnini that opened the door for the new Mass and all that it wrought. Annibale Bugnini was the architect of the new Mass, and I've done videos on him, including his stonecutter affiliation. But anyway, this pontiff, Pius XII, was, towards the end of his papacy, beginning to take written and spoken action against modernism. For example, recently it was discovered in the Vatican archives that he was working on a draft encyclical that would have reiterated Pope St. Pius X's rejection of modernism that he promulgated in his landmark encyclical Pascendi. Pius XII was going to update it for the situation that existed nearly 50 years after the passing of that saintly pontiff. But Pius XII passed away before that encyclical could be finished, and it was consigned to the dustbin by a much more jolly and innovative pope in John XXIII, who instead of addressing modernism sought to open the windows of the church to the world and let in the fetid air of secular modernity. Such is life, and such is what we are dealing with now. I mean, it worked out so well for the church, right? The subject of this letter today is the rejection of situation ethics. It's an older term in postmodern philosophy. Several decades later, Benedict XVI would reject relativism under the same guise, using more contemporary language. But here we see Pius XII rejecting it as it was the new moral philosophy of his time. And it should sound familiar. Instead of hard and fast laws that are bound in the laws of God and nature, we get ethical decisions that are separate from all external considerations, and only subject to reality as the individual sees it. This was emerging in the 1950s, and I'll provide several speeches and writings of Pius XII on this in the future. Clearly, this letter is relevant in our time, for it is the ruling system of most discourse in general. Just a couple of notes here. I say Pius XII wrote this, but it was penned on his behalf by Giuseppe Cardinal Pizzardo, who was the Bishop of Albano and the Secretary of the Holy Office. It is also worth noting here, or bearing in mind, that Francis recently stated that truth is not a system of doctrines and dogmas. He preached a works-based doctrine of doing charity and not worrying about that messy eternal truth stuff. Compare that to the message of this thing that I'm going to have for you here in a second. And one final note. This was translated from the Vatican website, so I hope you find the translation via Google acceptable. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed Saturday. Contra Doctrinam. Instruction on situation ethics to all ordinaries and to teachers in seminaries, in Athenaeums, or those teaching in universities of studies, and to lecturers and houses of religious studies. Promulgated by Pius XII on the 2nd of February, 1956. Contrary to the moral doctrine and its application that is traditional in the Catholic Church, there has begun to be spread about in many regions, even among Catholics, an ethical system that generally goes by the name of a certain situation ethics, and which they claim does not rest upon the principles of objective ethics, which ultimately is rooted in being itself. Rather, it is not merely subject to the same limit as objective ethics, but transcends it. The authors who follow this system hold that the decisive and ultimate norm of conduct is not the objective right order, determined by the laws of nature and known with certainty from that law, but a certain intimate judgment and light of the mind of each individual, by means of which in the concrete situation in which he is placed he learns what he ought to do. And so, according to them, this ultimate decision a man makes is not, as the objective ethics handed down by authors of great weight teaches, the application of the objective law to a particular case, which at the same time goes into account and weighs according to the rules of prudence the particular circumstances of the situation, but that immediate internal light and judgment. Ultimately, at least in many matters, this judgment is not measured, must not, and cannot be measured, as it regards its objective rectitude and truth, by any objective norm situated outside man and independent of his subjective persuasion, but is entirely self-sufficient. According to these authors, the traditional concept of human nature does not suffice, but recourse must be had to the concept of existent human nature, which in many respects does not have absolute objective value, but only a relative, and therefore changeable value, except perhaps for those few factors and principles that pertain to metaphysical, absolute, and unchangeable human nature. Of the same merely relative value is the traditional concept of the laws of nature. Thus, many things that are commonly considered today as absolute postulates of the natural law, according to their opinion and doctrine, rest upon the aforesaid concept of existent nature, and are therefore but relative and changeable. They can always be adapted to every situation. Having accepted these principles and put them into practice, they assert and teach that men are preserved or easily liberated from many otherwise insoluble ethical conflicts when each one judges in his own conscience, not primarily according to objective laws, but by means of that internal individual light based on personal intuition, what he must do in a concrete situation. Many of the things set forth in this system of situational ethics contradict the truth of the matter and the dictates of sound reason, betray traces of relativism and modernism, and wander far from the Catholic doctrine handed down through the centuries. In many of their assertions they are akin to several non-Catholic ethical systems. Having considered these things in order to avert the danger of the new morality of which the Supreme Pontiff Pope Pius XII spoke in the allocations held on the days of March 23rd and April 18th, 1952, and in order to safeguard the purity and intactness of Catholic doctrine, this Supreme Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office interdicts and prohibits this doctrine of situation ethics from being taught or approved under any name whatsoever it may be designated, whether in universities, athenaeums, seminaries, or houses of religious formation, or in books, dissertations, lectures, whether, as they say, at conferences, or by any other means of being propagated or defended. Given at Rome, from the palace of the Supreme Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office, on the day of February 2nd, the year 1956, Giuseppe Cardinal Pizzardo, Bishop of Albano, Secretary for Pope Pius XII. Thanks for listening to Pius XII's admonition and barring of instruction in this form of philosophy. I have some information for you that is separate from this episode, though. If you're not following Return to Tradition's Facebook page, consider doing so. This show can also be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, and most major broadcasting platforms. It's good backup for this place, especially when you're on the go. Also, the Return to Tradition website at returntotradition.org is something you should visit and maybe follow as well, again, as a backup. Not only do I post my show notes there, but I also post links to bonus material when it doesn't really fit this place, so check the website out. Anyway, thanks again for listening, and please, as always, pray for the Church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.